This is easily one of the most important and most favorite tools in my shop, but it isn't without its flaws, and today I want to talk about those. Hey guys, welcome back to Black Magic Craft. The Proxxon Thermocut Hotwire table. I use it all the time. It's crucial for what I do. While I have talked at length in videos about how you can work around not having one of these, having one of these unlocks a huge amount of potential for crafting and terrain building for the types of things I build. It allows me to do certain things I can't do with a knife, and it allows me to do a lot of the things I can do with a knife a lot faster and more accurate. So needless to say, I love it and I rely on it heavily, but it's not a perfect tool. It's kind of a cheaply made thing, and I think for a lot of what we do in this hobby, it gets pushed a little bit beyond its limits, and there's some things that you have to work around and some things I constantly see people get frustrated with. So today I'm going to talk about those flaws and how I cope with them or deal with them. The first thing is this factory guide, and if you go to the comments section of any Facebook post where people are discussing this tool, one of the things you will come across is people complaining about this guide. And some of those complaints are totally justified, and I think some of them are misinformed. The misinformed one, I think, is that people complain that this thing slides around and moves too freely. But the thing is, that's on purpose. This isn't just a rip fence, it's also a crosscut sled. So that means you want this to slide freely. So it's actually great that it does that, and it's important to keep that in mind. Some people also, I think, are a little bit misguided on the fact that this angle is a little bit hard to set perfectly true. But the thing is, it actually doesn't matter how this is set. When you are just ripping a piece through this way, you want to do a long cut, like a table saw cut. Doesn't matter if this is at a true 90 degrees or at an angle, because you are cutting on a very small point, not a long saw blade. So all that matters is the distance between here. If you have this at an angle, it's still going to be a straight cut. But the one complaint that is very big deal about this, that people really get upset about, is that there's no way to lock this in on the end, and it kind of flexes and it moves, and people get really upset about that and they get wavy cuts. That's a really easy problem to solve. All you do is put your hand on it. That's it. Just hold it, and then it's secure, and you push it through, because this tool is not a big production tool where you're meant to be cutting huge sheets. You're doing little delicate hobby stuff. So you use one hand to hold your material and one hand to hold the guide, and that's it. It's not that complicated. That being said, I don't see why they didn't just make a mechanism to lock this in place. They absolutely could have, and they absolutely should have, as it would have saved people a lot of grief. But none of those flaws are things that I care about. The problem I have with this guide is its height. It's only like 2 centimeters tall. And one of the main things I use this tool for is ripping down foam into thinner material. Because this guide is so short, that means it's very difficult to hold this material plumb, and you can end up with angled cuts. So you want something that is taller. And that's where aftermarket guides come in. I use this Guider Pro from shiftinglands.com, and it is absolutely ideal for me because it has this tall rip fence, which means that I can place material here, put it up against that fence, and keep it plumb and true as I guide the foam through the machine. Absolutely crucial. You need something like this. Now, you don't need to go out and buy it though. This is a very simple jig. You could absolutely make this yourself just with some MDF or some cardboard or whatever. Get creative. You just need something that is tall and a 90-degree angle to the table. But if you do want to buy one, Gerard at shiftinglands.com makes this one that is ready to go and is great. This is the Guider Pro. He also has the Guider Pro 2.0, which has 2 extra features. One is this little cutout at the bottom, which allows you to make a wider cut. The maximum distance you can get the fence away from the wire is bigger, and it has this removable piece. And the reason for this is that it has this groove here, so that if you want to set this wire to an angle, like say 45 degrees, it can actually pass through here, and you can still use this as a rip fence. Personally, I tend to not use this one very much because I find it to be bigger and more cumbersome. I actually like the original Guider Pro better, but those features are handy, and if you're only getting one, it may be worth considering getting that one. Now, an interesting thing about this is that it doesn't have a locking mechanism. So remember when I said on this one, it's easy to solve the problem because you use your free hand to hold it. Well, this one, it doesn't have a locking mechanism. So while this one won't flex and move like that one does, you still need to hold it, and it actually has this big handle here for you to do so. You are only using one hand to guide your material. It's just something you have to learn and get used to. That being said, there is a little trick if you want to lock it in place so you can free up both hands. The bottom of this just has a little wood rail that sits in this guide, and if you want to lock it in, it's just a matter of taking a little piece of paper towel, setting it where you want it, and then pushing it in. And that little bit of extra friction will actually hold it in place so you can free up your spare hand and use it that way. These are made out of wood. Some of them come with an MDF strip. I think some of them might come with a hardwood strip. And depending on where you live and your humidity level in your home, this may expand and contract, so yours may be tighter or looser than mine, so adjust accordingly. If you find it to be too tight, you can sand it down a little bit. If you find it to be too loose, well, you can use the paper towel method, but that's that. Now, when you want to actually cut, you need to set this wire, and you want this wire for most cuts to be exactly 90 degrees to the work surface so that if you pass material through against your 90-degree fence, you don't get an angled cut. So in order to do that, you need something to gauge the wire. All you do is loosen this and get it square. You can use a carpenter square. My carpenter square is a little bit too big. It actually goes past, which means I can't get it close to this wire. I can still use it and eyeball the space between the two and get it right. Or you can get a smaller carpenter square or just one of these plastic triangles from a little geometry set, and that can set your wire. Or if you are using a taller rip fence that you know is true, you can actually just use this and set the wire to the fence. Like anything, this takes a bit of practice, and you have to keep in mind how crucial it is. If you're just cutting thin material, it doesn't matter if it's a tiny bit out, but if you're ripping really tall material, obviously that angle is going to be more crucial. Adjusting this wire is where I think the biggest flaw in this machine lies. It's easy to adjust the wire left to right on the work surface to be true, but for certain cuts, you actually need this wire to be true front to back. Let's say you want to push in material this way and then move it. If this wire is angled front to back and you push material through this way, that angle is going to transfer to that cut, and you probably don't want that. This is where it kind of sucks, is that this wire sits in a little groove and there's no way to adjust this. And it seems like some people get machines where it's just true out of the box, and some it's out slightly and some it's out a lot. You can kind of try to bend it square. That sort of sucks. Underneath, this is where it's mounted. You can use some small shims in here, loosen up the set screw, put some small shims in here and try to get it right. That's really tricky and probably takes a lot of tries to get it right, but it is a nice permanent solution. Or you can just ignore this groove entirely. Let's say you need to adjust this wire slightly more towards the back at the top here. Don't use the groove. Just set it, pull it really tight until you get it where you want it. It's pretty simple. It's not ideal because that could move, but I found that testing that out, it actually does stay fairly secure. If you are really concerned about it, you could cut a little groove in there to hold the wire permanently. Thankfully, mine out of the box was pretty good and I don't have to worry about that. I would say that if yours ends up being way out, like more than like a millimeter or so, maybe talk to Proxxon about replacement, because that's not right. It shouldn't be that far out. Now, another tip in terms of adjusting the wire is that you can loosen all of this and set this wire at any angle you want. And you may be tempted to set it at something like 45 degrees and 90 degrees and then mark it on top here with a marker so that you can quickly and easily put it right back. And I did that when I had this tool early on. But as you can see, my 90-degree mark is way out from what is actually true. I don't know exactly why that is, but I think that this flex and maybe things changing over time, those marks prove to be very inaccurate long term, so I wouldn't bother doing something like that. So now you have your machine all set up, it's plumb, it's true, you got your guide sorted out, and you look at the temperature dial. It goes from 1 to 10, and this temperature dial is actually the main and most important feature of this tool, and what sets it apart from a lot of cheaper models is that you can adjust this, and that's really important because the thicker your foam is, the denser it is, the hotter you need that wire to be, and the faster you want to cut, the hotter you need it to be. So there's a lot of adjustment that needs to take place from different foam to different foam and different types of cuts. You're looking for a magic number. I know a lot of people ask, what is the magic number? And there's a little guide here that says some thicknesses and temperatures. I never used them. You got to do it by feel. And essentially, I like to just start out around 2 or 3 and then just test. If your wire is too hot, it's going to cut through this way too easily, and it's going to make a really wide cut. If you have it set too cool, it's going to take a lot of pressure and force, and you'll start to see this wire really bending, and you know you got to turn it up. So you got to just get a feel for it and adjust it to the thickness and density of the foam that you're using. But you also have to adjust it to the speed that you're cutting. Like I said, the slower you cut, the lower you want the temperature, because if it's too high and you're cutting slow, it's going to make those really wide burns. If you're cutting really fast and your wire is set to cool, then you're going to put a lot of force on the wire, and that's what's going to cause snapping. You really just have to get used to it. Just spend an hour or two when you first get this thing playing with different foam, testing out the temperature, and get used to adjusting it as you're working. And after a while, you'll start to learn what works best. If you're using white EPS foam, the kind of ball stuff, it's going to melt way faster and easier than this stuff, this XPS will, which is much denser. You may find that the numbers on here are hard to read, so you could just take some white paint and highlight those numbers. I've never bothered because I just got used to feeling for it. You can feel where it maxes out on each end. Eventually, you have to get good at doing it by feel anyway, so I don't think the visual reference is that important. Now, speaking of temperature, what makes this tool really great and makes working with foam a lot safer is that you can adjust the temperature to cut the foam at a correct, safe temperature. Now, when using a hot wire and foam of any kind, you want to have some ventilation, open a window, set up a fan. If you have a hood fan, great, but at least you want to have some ventilation. If you're cutting this at the correct temperature, it's only melting the foam and emitting some white smoke, which, yeah, you don't want to be breathing that in, but the really bad, dangerous smoke is when this stuff combusts, when it burns and it burns black. You don't want that. You don't want to be breathing that stuff. It's really nasty for you. And one of the reasons that happens is because the wire is too hot, or because when you finish a cut, a little piece gets stuck on there and it starts melting and burning. You don't want that. So what you want to get used to doing is when you're doing a cut, you want to get used to turning the power off immediately after so that last little bit doesn't stay and burn on the wire. So you got to practice that. Takes another free hand, which can be difficult when you're already doing different stuff. So Proxxon actually does sell a foot pedal switch, so it works like a sewing machine. Plug it into this thing and use your foot to turn the machine on and off, and that's really great and really handy, and I think that's the best way to use this machine. I don't own one yet. I haven't bothered to buy one. I probably should, because I think it makes this tool a lot easier to use and a lot safer. The other reason that's important is that if you leave those little pieces burning on your wire, that residue will eventually gum up this little hole that holds the wire, and you will run into the last problem with this tool, which is changing the wire when it snaps. And let me tell you, this wire will snap. You will break it over time. Thankfully, these machines come with something like 97 feet of wire, and you only use like 6 inches at a time, so you have like 180 snaps worth of wire. Don't buy an extra roll when you buy this thing. I've had this for 4 or so years, use it a lot, and I have most of my wire left. You will not run out for a long time unless you're doing something very, very wrong. but you will inevitably snap these wires. There's a couple reasons. One is that you're just putting too much stress on the wire. Your temperature is wrong and it just pushes and it snaps. It's a very delicate wire. The other reason is that maybe you've been working with it properly for a really long time and the wire just wears out and it gets thinner. All that heat, it just gets thinner and it snaps. It's gonna happen. So you have to adjust it. So the first thing you're gonna do is when it snaps is take out the wire, you open this tension knob here, release it, pull out the little piece of broken wire. And this is really important because they start to get stuck in there and they build up over time. And when you go to stick your new wire through, you may not be able to feed it through. And people run into this problem all the time where they can't get that wire back into the hole. So first thing you want to do is turn it over and see if there's any little wires sticking out the bottom. If there are, just pull them out from the bottom and clear up that hole. You may also have excess melted foam built up in there. And if that's the case, you want to get yourself a very, very, very fine needle, something as fine as this wire, to poke through and clean it out. And if that doesn't work, you can use some acetone. Acetone melts styrofoam. So if you just pour a little bit in there, it will dissolve that residue and clean out the wire. But be careful when you're pouring it because acetone will also remove this text and guidelines printed on top of your machine and you don't want that. And it will pour through this bottom hole and drip onto your cutting mat, and it will also remove the printed lines on your cutting mat. I learned that the hard way once. So put a paper towel underneath and be careful pouring it through. Poke a pin through, make sure this is opened up all the way, and you should be able to feed it through, no problem, and retighten it. And then it's just a matter of tightening this wire spool again, and you're good to go. Now you don't want this to be too tight. If it's super, super tight, it's gonna snap really easily, but if it's too loose, it's gonna bend and move on you. Keep in mind, when you heat the wire, it will expand and become looser. So you want it to be a little bit tighter than you want. It's hard to explain. Again, like the temperature, you have to get used to it. You will break a few wires and eventually you will learn what's an ideal tension on this thing. But something kind of like that. Also note that if you're doing a lot of cuts at a high temperature, it's going to really stretch this wire out. So it's not a bad idea to stop every once in a while and turn the wire off and let it quickly cool and get smaller. Let all those molecules come back together and get a little bit tighter. And you may have to put some more tension on it after a bunch of cuts. It's also really important that when you feed this wire over, you make sure it all stays on the spool and doesn't run underneath or on top. Sometimes people will go to do a cut and they'll see their wire's not heating up. This machine creates a circuit. So if the wire's not heating up, usually that means that the circuit isn't complete. So maybe it's not connected down here to the set screw, but more than likely up here, it's not connected to the spool as nicely and it's running underneath. So just make sure all that is nice and neat and tidy and everything is sitting where it should. That's really it, I think. There's probably some other issues that people run into that I've forgotten about. And if there's a problem you're having regularly with this tool, let me know in the comments section and I'll try to answer it there. These are just the things off the top of my head that I know I have struggled with throughout the years. So hopefully that helps get you started. If you like this video, hit the like button. Let me know in the comments. If you want to pick one of these up to kind of up your crafting or terrain building game, head over to blackmagiccraft.ca. There I have my essential equipment page with links to this and most of the other stuff that I use regularly. And lastly, if you really like this video and you want to help me keep making videos like this or the build videos that I usually do, you can help me do that by supporting the channel on Patreon. Patreon is one of the main reasons that I'm able to do this channel full time and make a video every week for the community. So if you want to help me keep doing it, that is the best way you can do it. Check it out. Love to have you as the newest member of the Blackmagic Craft Fellowship. That's it for this week, guys. Hope you enjoyed. See you again next week. Cheers.